A Mustang mare frantically paces the edge of a frozen lake, her F trapped beneath the ice, struggling to breathe. The storm rages around them, the wind howling through the barren wilderness. Everyone thought it was too late, but in the midst of the chaos, a lone rancher burdened by his own past arrives just in time to change everything. This is the story of survival, of unlikely bonds, and the raw power of compassion in the face of death. Get ready for a journey that will challenge everything you know about courage, hope, and the heart of a wild Mustang. The bitter cold of winter cut through the barren landscape, turning the once vibrant plains into a frozen wasteland. Snow swirled through the air, biting at the exposed skin of any creature foolish enough to brave the open fields. Yet there stood Dakota, the proud Mustang mare, her breath visible in the frigid air, watching intently as her FO took his first steps. Echo, her newborn FO, was a small fragile creature. His coat shimmered with frost and his legs, still weak from the strain of birth, trembled beneath him. Yet there was an undeniable strength in his eyes, a spark of life that filled Dakota with an overwhelming sense of pride. She had waited for this moment, this first glimpse of her F standing tall, and now it was finally here. She nuzzled him gently, urging him to rise again. When he stumbled, her ears twitched as she listened into the distant wind, the sound of the storm brewing on the horizon. It wasn't the right time for such a harsh storm, but Dakota knew better than to trust the whims of nature. She had seen her fair share of wild winters, and this one promised to be no different. She could feel it in her bones. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. With a soft nicker, Dakota stepped back, urging Echo to walk. Her heart swelled as she watched him taking his first unsteady steps across the snow-covered ground. The ice-cold earth beneath them was unforgiving, but Dakota didn't care. She would protect him no matter what, no matter how harsh the world around them became. Echo faltered again, his legs buckling beneath him, and this time he fell forward, sliding across the snow. Dakota moved quickly to catch him, her hoofs skidding across the ice, but the FO was already moving too quick for her to follow. She watched in horror as he slipped closer and closer to the edge of the frozen lake that lay before them. For a moment Dakota froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She had known about the lake, the thin ice that covered its surface, the danger it posed. She had seen horses before, wild and tame, fall victim to the fragility of winter's ice, but never had she imagined that it would be her own FO who would make the fatal mistake. Echo wobbled again, his little hooves scrambling on the icy surface. He let out a high-pitched whinny, his voice full of confusion and fear. Dakota's heart pounded in her chest, and she sprang forward, but the thin ice cracked beneath him with a sharp, deafening sound. Before she could even react, Echo disappeared into the freezing waters below. Dakota's breath caught in her throat as the ice closed over him. Her world narrowed to a single harrowing thought: her FO was drowning. In a desperate panic, she galloped to the edge of the lake, her hooves pounding against the frozen ground. She slid to a stop, her body trembling with fear as she stared at the spot where Echo had disappeared. The ice was too thick, too solid for her to break. She paid at it frantically, but it wouldn't give. She couldn't reach him. The wind howled around her, the storm growing louder, colder. Dakota's chest heaved with each breath, her heart racing. She called out, her voice a mix of desperation and anguish: Echo, Echo! But the icy waters held him captive, and there was nothing she could do. Time seemed to stretch on, each second dragging on like an eternity. She was alone, surrounded by the vast empty wilderness, with no one to help, no way to reach her full. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, any solution, but all she could do was stand there helpless, her heart breaking for the little FO who had fallen through the ice just as she thought all hope was lost. She saw a figure through the swirling snow, distant but approaching fast, a man on horseback. Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope igniting within her chest. Was this the help she had prayed for? Could he save her son? The rider came closer, his silhouette growing clearer against the storm. He was on a dark horse, riding swiftly, moving through the snow as though he had done it 1,000 times. His face was hidden beneath a weather-beaten hat, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his movements. He reined in his horse as he saw the situation unfold before him. His eyes scanned the frozen lake, and then his gaze shifted to Dakota, who stood at the edge, frantic and pleading. For a moment they locked eyes, and in that brief exchange something passed between them, an understanding, a silent communication. Without hesitation the man dismounted. He grabbed a rope from his saddle and hurried toward the ice. Dakota could hardly believe it. Someone had come, someone was going to try to save her. Full the snowstorm howled fiercely, as if the sky itself was angry, and the wind bit at their exposed skin. Dakota stood frozen, watching with a mixture of disbelief and hope as the man worked quickly. He moved with a sense of purpose, his hands skilled and steady despite the howling storm. He seemed undeterred by the fierce winds and freezing temperatures. Dakota's body trembled with both the cold and the anxiety that gripped her heart. Her eyes never left the man. She didn't fully understand why he was here or who he was, but one thing was certain: he was their only chance. The man surveyed the lake, his eyes narrowing As he examined the crack in the ice where Echko had fallen through Dakota's frantic calls echoed in the distance, but there was no answer from the water, no sound of her full struggling, no whinnies of distress, only the eerie silence of the storm. "I'm coming for you, little one," the man muttered under his breath, and with that he waded into the deep snow, moving toward the ice's edge. He was already breaking the ice with the axe he had pulled from his saddlebag, each swing sending jagged shards scattering across the frozen lake. The ice groaned and cracked, but he didn't stop. His determination was palpable. Dakota couldn't understand why he was risking his life, why a stranger would be willing to brave such a dangerous task. For a wild foe he had never met, but in that moment none of that mattered. Her only focus was Echo. He was out there trapped beneath the freezing water, and without help he would surely die. The man continued to hack at the ice, each stroke louder than the last. The storm raged around them, but he seemed oblivious to everything but the task at hand. Dakota stepped closer, her hooves leaving deep prints in the snow. She watched in tense silence, her heart pounding in her chest as the man struggled to break through the thick ice. Seconds stretched into minutes, and the minutes felt like hours. It felt like a lifetime since Echo had fallen through the ice, and Dakota could only pray that this man's efforts would not be in vain. With one final strike, the ice broke with a sharp, resounding crack, and the man's hand shot into the water, pulling at the ropes that were now tied to a sturdy branch nearby. Dakota watched, hope igniting once more as the man pulled hard, struggling against the weight of the frozen lake. A few moments later, a small, trembling body broke the surface. Echo, his coat was slick with water, his limbs limp, and his head hung low. He had been under the ice for far too long, but the man wasn't finished yet. He pulled harder, his arms straining with effort, until at last Echo's tiny body was pulled from the freezing lake. Dakota's heart skipped a beat, and she rushed forward, her instincts screaming to check on her foal. She went nudging him gently, feeling his cold body under her touch, but there was no response. He was unconscious, barely breathing. The man, seeing the Mare's panic, quickly moved to wrap a thick blanket around the FO, trying to warm him as best as he could. "You're going to be all right," he said softly, his voice rough from the cold. He rubbed his hands over Echo's trembling body, trying to generate some warmth, but the little FO wasn't responding. Dakota stood by, her eyes fixed on her son. She could feel her own body shaking from the cold, but it was nothing compared to the terror gnawing at her heart. Echo wasn't moving. Was he alive? Was it too late? The man worked quickly, his movements precise, as though he had done this before. He placed his hand on Echo's chest, pressing down gently, trying to revive the FO. The tension in the air was thick, a silent prayer hanging over them all. After what felt like an eternity, Echo's body gave a small shuddering breath, then another, and slowly, with the man's steady hands and Dakota's watchful presence, the FO began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. A surge of relief washed over Dakota, and she nuzzled her FO, licking the water from his coat. The storm still raged around them, but in that moment it didn't matter. Echo was alive. The man stepped back, watching as the M tended to her F. He looked up at the sky, the storm showing no signs of letting up, but his expression softened. "You're lucky," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but you won't last out here much longer." Dakota looked up at the man, her instincts telling her he was right. This storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. They couldn't stay out here much longer. The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rope, tying it securely around Echo's body. "You're going to have to trust me," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "We need to get you to safety and fast." Dakota hesitated, the protective instincts that had served her well throughout her life clashing with the need for survival, but she looked down at her FO, his eyes still weak but filled with gratitude, and she knew she had no choice. With a deep breath, Dakota nodded. Together the man, the May and her fold would face the storm, each step a desperate battle against the elements and time itself. The wind howled through the trees as the man guided his horse, with Dakota trotting closely behind her, full tied secure to the rope. The storm was relentless, a powerful force that showed no mercy to the travelers. Snow and ice whipped across the landscape, the horizon barely visible through the swirling mass of white. Despite the raging storm, Dakota stayed close, her instincts keeping her at the man's side. The weight of her survival pressed heavily on her heart. Echo had begun to regain his strength, but he was still fragile, his legs unsteady from the cold and the trauma of his near drowning. Dakota's protective instincts were on full alert as she watched over him, nudging him gently with her muzzle whenever he faltered. The man rode ahead, his eyes focused on the path ahead. His dark horse plodded through the snow, its hooves crunching on the frozen earth, each step slow but steady. The man's face was grim, his eyes scanning the storm, searching for any sign of shelter. He had no intention of stopping until he found somewhere safe for the FO and the M. Dakota's heart raced as she followed, her legs burning from the effort. She wasn't used to being led by a stranger, especially not one who had so suddenly appeared in her life, but in the absence of a better choice she trusted him. He had saved Echo's life when all Seemed lost. He was their only hope now. The man spoke over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the storm. We're close, just a little further. Dakota pushed forward, her hooves slipping on the ice, but she kept moving. She could feel the tension in the air. The storm was growing stronger and time was running out. She glanced over at Echo, who had fallen behind his small body, struggling to keep up. The FO was exhausted, each step a monumental effort. His breathing was shallow, his little body trembling with the cold. She nickered softly, urging him forward, but he stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. Once again Dakota immediately rushed to his side, nudging him gently to get him back on his feet. The FO let out a weak whinny, his eyes pleading for help. And for a moment it seemed as though the storm might swallow them whole. The man reined in his horse, turning back toward them. You're not going to make it at this pace, he said, his tone steady but urgent. He dismounted quickly and came to Dakota's side, his hand outstretched toward Echo. Dakota hesitated, her protective instincts flaring up. She wasn't sure if she could trust him fully, this man who had appeared out of nowhere, saving them from the lake. But she looked down at her foal, who was struggling to stand, his little body shivering uncontrollably. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes. With a heavy heart she stepped aside, allowing the man to take the FO into his arms. Echo let out a weak, almost helpless sound, but he didn't fight. He was too tired, too cold to resist. The man cradled him gently, wrapping him in his thick cloak, and for the first time Dakota allowed herself to breathe a little easier. Hold on, little one, the man murmured, his voice low and comforting as he rocked the FO in his arms. Dakota stayed close, her eyes never leaving her son as they continued their trek through the storm. She followed closely behind, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Where was he taking them? Was it really safe? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the world seemed to narrow around them. The storm, the cold, the snow, they all seemed so vast, so endless. Yet somewhere in the distance the man's horse began to pick up speed, the horse's hooves cutting through the snow faster now. The man's gaze never faltered, his eyes scanning the white wasteland ahead as if searching for something only he could see. And then through the storm there it was, a cabin, small but sturdy, nestled against the side of a mountain. The smoke from a chimney rose into the sky, faint but unmistakable. A flicker of light could be seen through the frost-covered windows. It was a haven, a place of safety in the middle of the unforgiving wilderness. The man's expression softened and he gave a quick nod. We're almost there, he said, more to himself than to Dakota. We going to make it? Dakota's heart swelled with relief. But the journey wasn't over. The storm was still fierce and they were running out of time. Her FO needed warmth, food, shelter, and above all he needed to rest. She pushed forward with renewed determination, her body aching but driven by the desperate need to reach the shelter before it was too late. The man's horse reached the cabin first and the man dismounted swiftly, still holding Echo in his arms. He moved quickly, pulling open the door to the cabin with one swift motion, and stepping inside. Dakota followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The warmth inside the cabin hit her like a wave and she immediately felt the tension in her muscles begin to ease. The man set Echo down on a pile of blankets in front of a roaring fire, his body shivering from the cold, but his expression was focused as he worked quickly. Stay here, he instructed, turning to Dakota. I'll make sure he's all right. Dakota watched as the man began to tend to Echo, wrapping him in more blankets and feeding him warm liquid to help revive his strength. She'd nickered softly, still unsure of the stranger but deeply grateful for the safety he had provided. For the first time in hours she allowed herself to relax inside the warmth of the cabin. The storm howled outside, but Dakota and Echo were safe, at least for the moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting a soft glow on the wooden walls. The smell of dry wood and freshly brewed tea filled the air. The man worked tirelessly, ensuring Echo's small body was tucked under layers of blankets, a bowl of warm broth resting beside him. Dakota stood by the fire, her coat steaming from the heat, but her eyes never left her foal. She was too anxious to rest. She had watched Echo slip under the ice, heard his desperate cries, and felt the weight of the fear that had gripped her heart when he didn't move. But now he was breathing and his small form was slowly beginning to warm. The man glanced over at Dakota, his brow furrowed with concern. You're doing the right thing by staying close to him, he said, his voice soft. The bond between a mother and her FO is powerful. You've been his strength. He needs you now more than ever. Dakota nickered in response, moving closer to her FO. She lowered her head to gently nudge him, her eyes filled with tenderness and quiet worry. Echo's eyes were closed and he still shivered slightly despite the warmth of the blankets. The man observed them both for a moment before he sighed, wiping his brow. He walked over to the table, pulling out a bundle of dried herbs from his peak. You've been through a lot, both of you, but you need rest, he said, looking back at Dakota. Her ears flicked in irritation. Rest? She couldn't rest, not while her FO was still so fragile. She would never leave him alone. The storm outside could have raged forever and she still wouldn't have left his side, but Before she could protest Echo, his eyes fluttered open, weak but alert. And he let out a soft horror whinny. Dakota immediately lowered her head to nuzzle him, the urgency in her touch. Clear she could see the light returning to his eyes, though his body was still stiff from the cold. It wasn't enough yet. He was alive, but he was still so weak she couldn't allow herself to relax. Not. Yet the man, seeing the full struggle, stepped forward cautiously. He reached into his bag again pulling out a small vial of something dark and thick. Here, he said, his voice low, this will help. A little more warmth inside him will go a long way. Dakota didn't understand all of it, but the man's actions were gentle, and Echo accepted the drink without protest. He made a small sound of discomfort at first, but as the warmth of the liquid began to spread through his body, his shivering began to subside. For a few moments there was silence. Only the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Echo's breathing filled the cabin. But then, just as Dakota was starting to feel a bit of peace wash over her, the man spoke again. His voice grave. "You're going to need more than just rest," he said, his tone serious. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon. It's only going to get worse." Dakota's heart sank at his words. She had been so focused on keeping Echo alive, on making sure he could breathe and feel warmth again, that she hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture. The storm was fierce, and they couldn't afford to wait around in a place that wasn't truly safe. They needed to get out soon. "What do you mean?" she finally asked, her voice low but laced with anxiety. The man turned toward the window, glancing out at the swirling blizzard. "I mean that we're trapped here for now. The snow's piled up so high out there that we can't go anywhere in this weather. We're stuck, and that means we're running out of time to find proper shelter for you and your FO." Dakota stared at him, her mind racing. What did this mean for them? What if they couldn't leave in time? What if Echo didn't get strong enough? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the alternative. She had seen what the storm could do, what it had already done to Echo. She wasn't ready to risk losing him, not after everything they had been through. The man could see the fear in her eyes. He softened his expression and walked over to her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said reassuringly, "we'll make it through this. You and your FO are strong. You've survived the worst of it already." His words were meant to comfort her, but they didn't completely ease the weight pressing down on her chest. The storm was getting worse, and even though they had found refuge for now, Dakota knew the danger wasn't over. Echo let out a small cough, his tiny body still shivering under the blankets. Dakota moved to him, immediately pressing her warm body against his for extra comfort. She had never been more grateful for the warmth of the fire and the shelter they had found, but it still wasn't enough. There was a long silent pause before the man spoke again, his voice solemn. "Listen, I've seen storms like this before. We'll have to stay put for now, but we need to keep the fire going and do everything we can to help your F recover. We'll need to ride out when we can, but it might not be tomorrow or the next day. It could be longer." Dakota nodded, her eyes fixed on Echo, and she nickered softly to him, reassuring him. The FO weakly raised his head, blinking up at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope. She wasn't going to let him down. She would do whatever it took to get them both through this storm. The man looked at her one last time, giving a nod of understanding. "I'll help you both. We'll get through this together." But deep down, Dakota knew that their fight wasn't over. The worst might be behind them, but the journey ahead would be just as challenging. The storm had only just begun. The storm raged through the night, its icy winds battering against the walls of the small cabin. Outside, the world was a blur of white. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, suffocating the landscape in a blanket of cold and chaos. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled and popped, but even the warmth it offered couldn't shake the tension that gripped the space. Dakota stood watched by the window, her dark eyes scanning the storm. Every now and then she would turn toward Echo, her FO, who lay resting under a mound of blankets near the hearth. His breathing had steadied over the course of the night, but he was still fragile. She could feel the weight of his vulnerability in the air, as if the storm itself was trying to take him away. The man was busy near the fire, his back turned to the window. He had been feeding Echo small doses of herbal remedies and warm liquids, but even his steady hands couldn't ease the worry that gnawed at him. Despite his calm demeanor, he was clearly concerned. He had mentioned the storm earlier, but now, as the hours passed and the weather showed no signs of relenting, the danger was becoming more real. "It's too quiet," the man muttered to himself, pacing across the room. "Too still." Dakota perked up, her ears flicking forward. She could sense the tension in his voice. She wasn't sure if she fully understood the man's words, but his unease was clear. The calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. She moved closer to Echo, nudging him gently to check on his condition. He was still too weak to stand, but his eyes were open now, his gaze following her every movement. His small body was warm, but his muscles trembled slightly, as though he was struggling to stay strong. Dakota nickered softly, her head lowering to his side, offering him what little comfort she could. He let out a faint, almost imperceptible whinny in response, and her heart swelled with a deep sense of love and protectiveness. The man turned to look at them, and for a Moment his expression softened. You're doing everything you can for him. He's lucky to have a mother like you, he said quietly. Dakota wasn't sure how to respond, but she gave a soft whinny in acknowledgement, grateful for the man's support even if she still wasn't sure if she trusted him entirely. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the howling winds now mixed with strange noises, twigs snapping, the groan of trees bending under the pressure of the snow. The man walked to the door and peered out, his eyes narrowing against the swirling wind. We're not safe here, he said suddenly, turning back to Dakota. His voice was firm, a stark contrast to the unease he had shown before. There's something out there. Dakota's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The air felt charged with a strange energy, and she couldn't shake the sense that danger was drawing near. The man grabbed his coat, slinging it over his shoulders, his face set in grim determination. I have to go, he said, his tone brokering no argument. Stay with your FO, keep him safe. He moved to the door, but before he could open it there was a loud bang. The door shook under the force of something slamming against it. Dakota's muscles tensed and she took a cautious step back. The man's hand hovered over the handle, and he hesitated for a moment. Then he swung the door open just enough to peek outside. The storm, once deafening, seemed to grow even more intense. The wind howled, but this time there was something else, a growl, deep and guttural, coming from the shadows of the trees. The man's face paled. It's too late, he murmured under his breath. Dakota's heart raced. She couldn't see what was out there, but the growl sent a chill through her. She moved closer to Echo, instinctively trying to shield him with her own body. He let out a weak whimper and she pressed her side against his, offering whatever comfort she could. The man stepped outside, his figure swallowed by the storm. Dakota's ears flicked back and she glanced nervously toward the door. Every fiber of her being told her to stay by her FO, to protect him from whatever was out there, but her instincts also told her that something far more dangerous was on its way. The growl grew louder, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to echo through the trees. Dakota's heart pounded in her chest and she pawed at the ground nervously. Was it a predator? Was it something larger, something she couldn't fight off alone? She glanced back at Echo, her thoughts racing. If anything happened to the man, how would they survive? A shape appeared in the distance, large and looming, moving through the snow with surprising speed. Dakota's breath caught in her throat. It was too big to be a wolf, too powerful to be just an ordinary creature. The shape grew larger and soon she could see its features, a massive shadowy figure like a wild beast from the deepest forests, its eyes glowing faintly in the storm. It was a bear. Dakota's heart stopped. The massive animal was heading straight for the cabin, its growls becoming louder, more ferocious. She stood still for a moment, frozen in fear. Echo was too weak to run. She was the only one who could protect him now, but she was no match for a bear. The bear's massive silhouette loomed in the swirling snow outside, its growls low and ominous, growing louder as it approached the cabin. Dakota's heart pounded in her chest, her every instinct screaming at her to protect her FO. She could feel the warmth of Echo's small body against hers, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath. Still weak, still fragile, but alive. That was all that mattered. She glanced toward the door, where the man had stepped outside, his voice barely audible in the storm. What was he thinking? What could he possibly do against something so powerful? Panic surged within her, but she couldn't move. She couldn't leave her foal alone. The growl grew closer, the ground beneath Dakota's hooves shaking with each heavy step the bear took. She took a step back, her body tense, but her gaze never left the door. Her instincts told her to stand strong, to defend her foal, but she was only a horse. What could she do? Echo stirred beside her, his weak body trying to rise. His eyes were wide, panic evident in them. Dakota nickered softly, nudging him back down with her muzzle, trying to reassure him he was still too young, too fragile to understand the danger that was closing in. She had to keep him safe. That was her only thought now. The door to the cabin creaked open and the man stepped inside, his face pale and full of concern. He moved quickly toward Dakota, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Echo. We have to leave, he said, his voice tight with urgency. The bear is getting too close. We won't survive this storm if we stay here. Dakota turned her head toward him, her eyes filled with confusion. Leave? Where would they go? The storm outside was merciless, the snow piled high against the walls of the cabin. There was nowhere to go but into the wilderness, and she couldn't risk Echo's fragile state. She could barely keep him warm, let alone navigate through the treacherous conditions outside. But the man was right about one thing: they couldn't stay here. The bear wasn't going to just leave. It was hungry, desperate, and the scent of life inside the cabin had drawn it in. Dakota had no idea how long they could survive in these conditions, how long they could survive against this wild threat. Her hood scraped the floor nervously as she moved closer to Echo, blocking him from view. Her protective instinct were on overdrive. She would fight for him. She would fight with everything she had. The man grabbed a rope from his pack, tying it around his waist and securing it to a post near the door. We need to get out of here, he repeated, his voice more insistent now. I'll lead the way. Stay close and we'll make it. Dakota whined softly, uncertain. She could feel the weight of Echo's small form against her, his fragile legs barely able to stand. How could she leave the safety of the cabin in the middle of a storm with a bear just outside? But what other choice? Did she have the man move toward the door again, preparing to open it? The air inside was tense, every breath felt heavy. Thick with anxiety, Echo's breathing had quickened and he pawed nervously at the ground. He was still too weak to understand the urgency, but he could sense the danger. He let out a soft whimper. Dakota lowered her head and gently nudged him toward the door, her heart swelling with the need to protect him. She could do this, she had to. The man opened the door just a crack, peering outside to gauge the distance of the bear. The storm howled in a furious crescendo, but the growl of the bear was unmistakable. It was closer now, too close. Suddenly the man's eyes went wide. "It's here," he breathed. Dakota's heart leapt in her chest. The bear was right outside. She could see its massive shape moving through the blizzard, its glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. The man turned quick, grabbing a bundle of hay from a corner of the cabin and throwing it toward the door, hoping to distract the beast, but the bear's eyes never left them. It roared, a sound that vibrated the very earth beneath Dakota's hooves, and it charged toward the door. Without thinking, Dakota leapt into action. She shoved Echo backward with all her strength, pushing him behind a stack of crates near the fire. Her hooves dug into the cold wooden floor as she spun around to face the door. There was no time to think, she had to act. She was the only thing between her foe and the bear. Her body trembled with fear, but there was no retreat. She would not let this beast take her full. The bear was nearly at the door now, its heavy paws pounding against the snow. Dakota felt her heart hammer in her chest. This was it, the moment she would either live or die, but she wasn't going to let her foe face this alone. The man stood beside her, a look of pure determination in his eyes. He had no weapons, nothing but his own strength, but together they might have a chance. "I'll hold it off as long as I can," he said through gritted teeth. "You need to get him out of here now." Dakota glanced at him, nodding once. She knew what she had to do. She had to protect Echo. She had to give him the chance to live. With a final glance at the man, Dakota turned toward the door. The bear was almost within reach. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. With one final push, she charged toward the door, her hooves pounding the ground as she prepared to face the creature that threatened everything she loved. The door creaked as it was pushed open wider, the storm's howl filling the cabin. Dakota stood in the doorway, her body braced against the cold wind, her eyes locked on the massive bear now only a few feet away. Her heart thudded in her chest, but there was no fear in her stance, only determination. This was her moment, the moment when a mother's love would stand firm against the greatest of threats. The bear, a hulking mass of muscle and fur, let out a ferocious roar that echoed through the storm, its yellow eyes locked on her, wild hunger in its gaze. It knew what it wanted, and it was too close now for Dakota to retreat. Her foe was behind her, safe for the moment, but that wouldn't last unless she held the line. She stood between the bear and the small shelter where Echo lay, her legs slightly apart, muscles tensed, ready to fight. Her man whipped wildly in the wind, her body trembling from the cold, but her spirit burned hot with the fire of protection. The man moved slowly toward the bear, trying to draw its attention away from Dakota and Echo. He shouted, waving his arms to distract it, but the bear wasn't fooled. It had its sights set on Dakota, and nothing was going to make it change course. It lunged. Dakota wasn't fast enough to avoid the bear's charge, but she was fast enough to react. She sidestepped, using her powerful hind legs to deliver a sharp kick to the bear's side. The impact was enough to stagger the creature, but it only enraged it more. With a growl, the bear whipped around, slashing at her with its claws. The man screamed for her to move, but there was no way she was leaving her full. Dakota stood her ground, dodging the bear's swipes with a grace that came from years of survival in the wild. She was quick, but the bear was relentless. Each strike was like the crashing of thunder against the earth, each movement of testament to the danger closing in. The man rushed forward, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the ground and using it as a makeshift weapon. He swung it toward the bear's head, striking it with all his strength. The bear staggered back for a moment, growling, but it didn't retreat. It was too powerful, too angry to back down. Now Dakota watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. She had to protect Echo. That was all that mattered now. Her muscles burned with fatigue, but she had no choice but to fight. The man's voice was barely audible over the howling storm, but his words reached her. "Go take him and run." Dakota's head jerked toward Echo's hiding place. He was still too weak to move on his own. She couldn't leave him behind, but the man was right. The only chance they had was to run, to get as far from the bear as possible. With a sharp nicker, Dakota turned and charged toward the pile of crates where Echo was, her hooves dug into the snow-covered floor as she rushed to his side, nudging him gently with her nose. His small fragile body was trembling, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't move. He was too weak to run. Dakota lowered her head to his side, nudging him forward with all her strength. "We have to go," she whispered softly, urging him to rise. "We have to get out of here." Echo struggled to lift himself, his legs shaking beneath him, but he finally managed to stand his Legs were wobbly, his body weak, but he stood supported by Dakota's unyielding press. She nickered softly, pushing him gently toward the door behind them. The man was still fighting the bear off. His every move was a desperate attempt to keep the creature at bay, but it was clear he couldn't hold out much longer. The bear was too powerful, too fast. Dakota could hear its growls, its claws raking against the ground, coming closer with every passing second. Go, the man shouted one last time, his voice full of desperation. Without another thought, Dakota turned and ran. She pushed Echo ahead of her, urging him forward despite his weak legs. The snow stung her eyes, the wind whipped against her face, but there was no time to hesitate. The storm had become their enemy, but the bear was a threat they couldn't outrun unless they acted now. They ran through the storm, dodging snow drifts and trees, her hooves sinking deep into the powder. Echo struggled to keep up, but Dakota was there every step of the way, guiding him, protecting him. She could hear the bear's grove fading behind them, but she didn't dare look back. She couldn't stop, not until they were safe. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small ridge, a narrow path that led down toward the river. The storm still raged around them, but they had managed to put distance between themselves and the bear. Dakota's muscles burned with exhaustion, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Echo let out a weak whinny, his head hanging low. He was struggling, but he was still with her. That was all that mattered. They continued onward, moving slowly now as the storm began to lose its intensity. The wind had died down, the snow no longer falling in thick suffocating sheets. They had made it by some miracle. They had made it out of the worst of the storm. As they crested the final hill, the man appeared beside them, his face blooded and bruised, but his eyes were filled with relief. He had made it. He had kept them safe, the three of them. Dakota, Echo, and the man stood together at the edge of the frozen river, watching as the storm finally began to subside. The danger had passed, but the bond between them was forever changed. They had survived together. Dakota nuzzled Echo, her heart swelling with pride and love. Against all odds, they had made it through. They had faced the wildest of challenges, and in the end it was their courage and determination that had carried them through. As the last remnants of the storm faded, Dakota looked out over the horizon, her heart at peace. They were safe for now, and that was enough. Dakota and Echo's journey proves that no storm, no matter how fierce, can break the bond of love and courage. Their story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable spirit of a mother's protection. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with someone who believes in the strength of love and the courage to overcome any obstacle. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales.